friends. Welcome to everyone out there. We're super excited to be joined by the amazing Josh Allen and Spooky Friends. So we're going to be talking all about Josh's brand new spooky story collection, Only If You Dare. But first of all, let's see who is here tonight. So let's kind of go around and tell us who you are, maybe show off a little cover or two. And if we're getting some feedback, you might need to mute yourself when other people aren't talking because I'm hearing a little feedback. But Josh Roberts, tell us about yourself.
I'm other Josh. I'm Josh Roberts. I'm the author of The Witches of Willow Cove, which is here behind me, which came out last May. And I'm currently working on a sequel. And I'm here and super excited to talk about Josh Allen's short story collection.
Yeah, we're all super excited. I see Allie has the Scary Stories shirt. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm Allie Melanenko. I'm the author of Ghost Girl, which just came out this August, and next year Disappearing House will be out. And I am also super excited to be here and talk about Josh's amazing collection. I read both of them like back to back, and let me tell you, I got some feelings, got some scared feelings.
We're having lots of feelings over here. Well, I'm excited to see y'all, and I'm Kim Ventrella, author of various spooky titles. Had these two come out last year, Hello Future Me and The Secret Life of Sam. A couple spooky babies before that, Bone Hollow and Skeleton Tree. And my spooky story contribution. I just have one story in this one, but Don't Turn Out the Lights. It's another one for fans of the Scary Stories collection. It has things by 35 different authors in there. But let's head over to, of course, Josh Allen in the hot seat for tonight. So first of all, just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your books, and then we will start grilling you with the tough questions, the really tough ones. I hope you're ready.
I'm looking forward to it. First of all, thank you so much for being here, Kim, Josh, Allie. It's such a pleasure to be here with good friends and good writers whose work I admire and respect. And I'm Josh Allen. I'm the author of 2 collections of short stories. My first one, which came out in 2019, Out to Get You, 13 Tales of Weirdness and Woe. And my second collection, which came out about 3 weeks ago, I think, Only If You Dare, 13 Stories of Darkness and Doom. And I write about ordinary things that turn really creepy, like the haunted paper towel dispenser in the boys' bathroom, a haunted street sign, the world's grossest bowl of oatmeal. I have a feeling we may talk about the world's grossest bowl of oatmeal later. Ordinary, everyday things that have phantasmagoric possibilities that turn spooky and creepy. So I write short fiction because I'm really interested in appealing to reluctant readers. I think there's a lot of kids out there, if you hand them a 250-page book, that can be kind of intimidating. But if you ask them to read an 8-page story, I think they'll give it a try. And if they like it, maybe they read the next one. And if they like that one, maybe they read the next one. And the next thing you know, they're a third the way through the book and they're thinking that they can do it. So I'm pretty passionate about short fiction. That's me and that's what I do. And I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. I also love short fiction. I mean, it's just daunting sometimes to pick up a whole novel. Like, I've read all of Stephen King's short stories, but not all of the novels. So yeah, short stories are like their own art. But like you said, what you're known for is this taking ordinary things and turning them into nightmares that will haunt children's dreams for the rest of their lives.
We hope.
We hope. Like the oatmeal. The oatmeal is like probably my favorite one because it's so grotesque, right? I mean, tell us a little bit more about the oatmeal. Was this inspired by real life oatmeal that you were forced to eat as a kid or something?
I hate oatmeal.
What?
Yes,
No,
shocker, right?
It's so good.
Oatmeal is my least favorite food on the whole entire planet. When I was a kid, my mom would make oatmeal for breakfast. I'd go into the kitchen and she'd slide my bowl in front of me with oatmeal in it. And the rule in my family was you had to take as many bites as how old you were. So if you were 8 years old, you had to take at least 8 bites. And if you were 12 years old, you had to take at least 12 bites. And I remember like trying to take the smallest bites possible, like when I was 10 years old, and my mom saying, that doesn't count as a bite, right? That doesn't count as a bite. And me trying to figure out what exactly would count as a bite. And so in this story, the main character, like me, hates oatmeal. She gets up in the morning and her mom slides a bowl of oatmeal in front of her and tells her she has to eat it. But instead, when her mom's not looking, she throws it away. And then that night at 3:13 in the morning, the microwave in the kitchen comes on all by itself. She stumbles out into the kitchen. The only light that's on is coming from the microwave with something inside it spinning, and the microwave counts down 3, 2, 1, end. And the girl's name is Elena. She opens the microwave and there's her bowl of oatmeal returned to her. The bowl of oatmeal that she scraped into the garbage when her mom wasn't looking. But it's not just the bowl of oatmeal that's come back. In the bowl of oatmeal, there are bits of garbage. Like it's the same oatmeal that's been scooped up from the garbage and returned to her. She throws it away and it comes back the next night. Then she throws it away again and it keeps coming back and getting grosser and moldier and nastier. And chaos then ensues.
Yes, as it does. It's such a delight. It just makes me want to have like a big heaping bowl of oatmeal, lots of like raisins and garbage, maybe a little like cockroach or something squirming under there.
Brown sugar. The secret is brown sugar.
There is no secret.
Maple syrup, brown sugar, that's all you need. It tastes
brown
amazing.
Sugar can't save that oatmeal. Nothing can save that oatmeal.
Actually, I'm definitely stealing your mom's idea for number of bites based on how old you are for my 2 kids. So
okay.
And now Josh's children hate me.
I'll be like, here, read this book.
Have you ever gone home now when you're like older and you're like, your mom's like, okay,
that'll be 47 bites.
Because that would be rough.
She puts the world's biggest bowl of oatmeal in front of me. 47, bucko.
Oh, well, that is some oatmeal, but I do want to remind our viewers that we're taking questions for Josh. So it's not just us who are going to give Josh the hardest questions, but we are taking questions from you too. So if you have a question, get that one in the comments. But let me turn it over to Allie because I can see that you're dying to ask a question.
So since we're talking about the oatmeal story, which was absolutely one of my favorite ones, that and the haunted paper towel dispenser, which I think was just brilliant. Like I spent the entire time reading that being like, where are we going here, man? Josh, where are we going? And I'm just really curious, because like so much of horror is about, not so, but a lot of horror, like traffics and tropes, there's ghosts, there's haunted houses, there's vampires, all of that stuff. And you instead were like, no, this is just going to be like a scary paper towel dispenser. Like at one point I was like, when does the scary plant show up? And then I was like, wait, they already made that movie. So he wouldn't do that. So I'm just curious, like, that's such an interesting choice. And you did it in both of your collections. And I just want to know, like, where does that come from? Because I'm fascinated.
Well, I'm really interested. So I'm a college professor, and one concept we talk a lot about in contemporary literature, in university literature classes, is a concept called defamiliarization. And the idea, the whole idea behind defamiliarization is you take something that's familiar to your audience, something that they've seen a million times, and you try to make it seem unfamiliar or new, or you reinvent that thing in a way that the audience has never considered before, right? So maybe, so you can do this with anything, but I'm really drawn to things that we see every single day that we never ever pay attention to. Things like a school crossing sign. So like one of my stories in my first book is about the yellow school crossing sign that's shaped like a house, and it has the boy and the girl in the crosswalk. And we've all probably seen this thing 1,000 times. And if you ask people who's walking in front in a school crossing sign, the boy or the girl, they usually can't tell you. Right? They have no idea. They can't tell you who's walking in front, the boy or the girl. And you can start to mess with their head and you can tell them, oh, it's the boy. I'm just kidding, it's the girl. And then they're like, I can see it both ways, even though they've passed this thing 1,000 times in their life. Defamiliarization is all about taking things that are an ordinary, everyday part of our lives that we've seen so much that they become familiar, and you try to make it unfamiliar. You try to make us feel something new about it that we've never seen before, so that the next time we see a school crossing sign, we'll look at it and we'll think about it differently, right? Or the next time you eat oatmeal, you'll think about oatmeal differently. I've declared war on oatmeal, basically. The next time that you are in the bathroom and there's a paper towel dispenser, you'll think about that paper towel dispenser differently. And for me, it's partly about reawakening our senses to things that have become so commonplace, they've basically become dead to us, right? So microwaves, school crossing signs, paper towel dispensers, these sorts of things. Reawakening our senses to things that have become dead to us is what I'm really interested in.
Well, I have to say, congratulations, success, because I've looked at every paper towel dispenser differently since I read your book. I'm like, am I going to get a message? What happens next?
That haunting, blinking eye
right?
in the paper towel dispenser.
I mean, it is like even the microwave is now unsettling. Like this is you're doing a whole thing, is what I'm saying.
Not just looking at things differently, but also with like a fair degree of suspicion now.
A kid told me in a school visit last year, he'd read my first book and he said, okay, you've ruined couches for me. You've ruined school crossing signs for me. And I just read him the oatmeal story in the school visit. And he's like, and now you've ruined microwaves for me. And he said, my only question for you is this: why are you ruining everything, man?
That is brilliant.
Did you tell him you're going to ruin pillows? Like he'll never be able to sleep again because
pillows are already ruined.
Yeah, because the pillow story
pillows are ruined.
Is pretty awesome. Mm-hmm. So. I love it. I'm just sad that like I didn't plan ahead, because I should have had like a huge bowl of oatmeal like below the desk here, and then I could have just brought it up and been just like snacking on it while you were eating, like while you were talking the whole time. That
so many people give me oatmeal now.
That's amazing.
Well, if we could have had someone sort of come up behind Josh with a bowl and bring it towards him, on the screen, horror movie like.
That would be amazing. But yeah, so I love that idea though. That's such an interesting take on horror that I think all writers can learn from. And Josh, let's put the two Joshes together. Let's have a war of the Joshes and see what question Josh can come up with for Josh.
Well, I'm really interested in short story as a form in general, because it amazes me with 8-10 pages how you're able to make me invested in a character and fear for that character, while also introducing this sort of high concept of this haunted object or something. So how do you approach the short stories that you're writing in a way that is getting me so invested in these characters so quickly?
Well, in short fiction, every word has to matter, right? Every image, every detail has to kind of communicate enormous weight. And so I found that for writing short fiction, reading poetry helps a great deal, right? Poetry is probably the most condensed of written forms, that relies very heavily on, kind of like orange juice concentrate, right? We boil out all of the impurities and we end up with this like really potent thing. And to navigate short forms, to write a short story, I think you need to boil down every image to kind of its most potent moment. Every line of dialogue, you have to work really hard to make it its most kind of potent moment, because there's no time to waste, as you say, Josh, right? You got to get readers invested in these characters. You got to introduce this concept of a spooky haunted paper towel dispenser or whatever it is, and you have to do it really, really efficiently. And so for me, reading poetry has been crucial to developing the skill of writing short stories. Just because poetry it's such a genre that is image driven, right? Where one image needs to do tons of work. I go back to the poet William Carlos Williams, great American poet William Carlos Williams. He said this: "There are no ideas but in things." And so you got to find the right thing to communicate the idea, again, sounding like an English professor, what we might call the objective correlative, right? So I spent a lot of time thinking about William Carlos Williams and T.S. Eliot and what these people taught us about images and poetry. And I try to translate that over to short fiction the best that I can.
I love that.
Sorry, I was just going to say, as someone who writes poetry, that was very unexpected, and I absolutely love it. Like, I love that is a form that you choose to, like, get inspired by in order to write these incredible stories. I think that's amazing.
Oh, thank you.
And now we're learning all kinds of things, like Allie writing poetry. I love that. And I love that, like, you're probably not going to get a scholarly quote unless Josh Allen is here. So now Josh is here. We're going to get the quotes. The quotes are memorized. They're coming. We love the quotes. But you got me thinking, Josh Roberts, when you're asking your question about short stories and the form, and my thought is kind of coming back to a conversation I was having recently with some other writer friends on the ability to, like, objectively judge your work. How do you know when you're writing a short story that you've created something that will be satisfying for readers? Like, how are you able to gauge that objectively as the author?
I don't know that I'm very good at it. And so I'm pretty hard on myself as a writer. And usually when I'm in the midst of it, I'm in the midst of, like, drafting a story or revising a story, I'm constantly telling myself that, just keep going. You can fix it later. You can fix it later. You can fix it later. And I have to sort of force myself through a draft, believing that I can fix it later, because it all feels very raw. It all feels very, like, bad to me in those early stages. And I just have to push through. Luckily, I have a really great support system of readers that I trust. Working in an English department at a university, I have a lot of colleagues that I can share my work with, and they can give me feedback and tell me what's working and what's not. I have a really great agent who has good taste and can tell me what's working and what not. And of course, my editor is fantastic about these kinds of things. But I'm not one of these writers who sits down to the keyboard and is like, "Oh yeah, I'm on today. This is work. This is gold," right? Like, I've maybe had that feeling twice in my life. Mostly what I do is I write and I'm like, why am I doing this? What is wrong with me? Why can't I stop typing these words? Why am I forcing myself to do? I'm sort of more that kind of writer, and I just sort of push through and have faith that eventually through the process, eventually the kinks are going to be worked out, and eventually it's going to be put together in a way that works for readers. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't, right? Sometimes I've written far more stories than I've published. I don't even want to tell you the ratio, right? But when I write a book of 13 short stories, I don't start with 13 short stories, right? When I send this to my agent, I start with way more than 13. Yeah, I may start with like 25 or 30. And then my agent and I will parse it down to, like, I don't know, 18 or 19. And then we'll send that to my editor, and then she and I will work to parse it down to the 13 we think are the finest of those. And so, I mean, most of the pages that I write will never see the light of day. And I think that's true of most writers, though, that most of the pages we write are never going to see the light of day.
Oh, yeah. Well, for me, I know it's true. And those are like little novel babies that will just be hiding in the trunks forever. So yes, they're hiding. Yeah, I love that, though. Every writer is different. So I think it's really important to remember that just because your process isn't the same as someone else, or you have like a lot of self-doubt at different points in the process. That's really normal. You know, for me, I'm usually like, when I'm writing, I'm like, it's amazing, I love it. And then progressively I go more and more and more toward hate, like self-doubt, and like, this is the worst thing that's ever been written. And it just slowly dies until it's like the worst thing that's ever existed. So that's me, but it's interesting to hear that everybody has like their own way of interacting with the writing. So I love that. But yes, in reminder, we are taking your questions too, so get those in the chat. But I know, Allie, you were curious about like the number of stories that were maybe unpublished. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I was. That was one of the questions I had, and like, it's really interesting to me to think that like you could have written like 25 to 30 stories just to whittle it down to the 13. And I'm really curious, like, what is the like, I understand you and your agent look at what you think is best, but like, what is your criteria for what works? And I say this also because I feel like there are some things in this book, well, in both your books, but we're going to talk about this book. There are some things in this book that I'm like, oh, that's a creepy, spooky story. And then there's some things where I'm like, what? And I'm just going to just say, like, my hand right there is a what? Because like, I was like, this is
I love
what? So I'm just curious, like, how you find that balance, and like, for you personally, like, how far do you like to push the horror for the stories that you tell? Like, do you prefer the kind of like I really love the cheeky, the very opening one, The Substitute, you know, and it was very cheeky, and I was like, oh, I see what you did there. That was good. That was a fun opening. But like, then there's the like, my hand, it's right there.
Are you okay, Allie? I'm just.
I'm really not, honestly. That went to a place I was not expecting at all. So walk me through it, please. Walk me through it.
So
how do you decide?
when I sit down to draft, like, and I'm working on these stories, I'm kind of in my playground, right? I need to feel like I'm in the sandbox, and that I'm allowed to create whatever I want when I'm in that sandbox. If I don't give myself that kind of freedom, I don't think you can be creator and critic at the same time. Like, at least I can't, right? I don't think you can be creator and critic at the same time. At some point, you need to switch on your inner critic and go back, but that's called revision, right? But when I'm in the drafting stage, I just need to play in the sandbox. And so I don't spend a lot of time when I'm drafting thinking about whether what I'm writing is too gory. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about what I'm writing, whether it kind of works or not. I'm just playing, right? I'm a kid in the sandbox, seeing what I can make. And so sometimes what I make ends up being too absurd. I'm writing a story right now that I'm trying to get finished up about a really creepy Pop-Tart. And now's not the time for me to ask whether that can work. Now's the time for me to play. And right now, I'm enamored of the idea of like a really creepy Pop-Tart. I think that just feels cool to me, and I want to play with that. But I might decide 6 months down the road when I look at it that it's too bizarre, right? That's just too far out there. But today's not the day for me to ask that question. I have one story I wrote with my first book. This will never be published. I also need to be free to explore as much horror as I want. If I kind of slam on the brakes, or if I spend time condescending to children by thinking they're too delicate to handle things, I don't end up going where I need to go as a children's horror author. And so there's a story from my first book about a kid who he drops something and he makes a big rip in the carpet of his biology classroom, a big tear in the carpet of his biology classroom. He like drops a beaker or something, I can't remember, but he falls on top of it. And at the same time he rips the carpet, he cuts himself a little bit right here. And then the next day he trips over that rip in the carpet and expands the rip. And at the same time the rip expands in the carpet, the cut in his chest also expands. And this continues to happen as he gets more and more injured and wounded, as the carpet gets torn. And eventually the carpet is replaced. And the final scene, this is just so horrible. The final scene is this kid walking home from school, and he sees a carpet van on its way into the school to replace the carpet, and they tear out the carpet out of the biology room and the kid gets skinned alive. So that's maybe too far.
I'm just maniacally laughing. I don't think it's too far. I would do that. Like, come on.
So that's a story where so I created that story, and I learned a lot from writing that story, but it's probably too far for like 10-year-olds, right?
But
a kid
it's
getting
a
skinned alive
collection.
in
So
the gutter.
You have the one where they're flayed, and then you have the next one that's like a funny, light romp. So
Yeah, and the next one's about a creepy Pop-Tart.
Exactly.
So what you have going on there, right?
Well, I'm just going to propose oatmeal flavored Pop-Tart. Run with it. All yours.
There you go. There you go.
So, but I guess what I'm saying is when you're in the sandbox, you need to be free to play with all of this, to push the limits a little bit, and to try that kind of horror. You sometimes, in order to find out what works, you have to write something that doesn't.
Yeah.
And for me, short fiction is very much about that. In order to write short stories that work, I feel like you have to write a lot of short stories that don't, and to figure out where kind of the limit is in horror, to figure out what your audience can handle, what forms work, those sorts of things. So if you thought My Hand Right There was bad, Allie, how about that one for you?
No, listen, it's a lot. I'm sorry. The thing, again, I'm not going to ruin this for anybody, but the thing about My Hand Right There is that, like, you set the scene just in the title alone, and I'm reading and I'm like, no, he's not gonna. It's not. He's and then it just ends, and I'm like, oh, you did that thing. You did the thing. And it was amazing. And I think about it a lot, is what I'm saying. So kudos to you, because you're like renting space up in here with your stories in my brain for free.
You're not alone in the way you feel about that story. I told my mother that story before the book came out, and the way she looked at me made me suspect that I've been written out of the will.
I mean, yeah, probably you have been.
So Josh, you talked earlier about the sort of one of the things that you approach when you're trying to do when you write, which is taking the unfamiliar or taking the familiar and making us think about it differently. But why do you choose to do that with sort of the spooky / horror flavor?
Well, I think that if we're going to take something and make it unfamiliar, I feel like horror, especially, and maybe the fact that I write short stories is related to this. Horror is a way to catalyze that move that I'm trying to make, right? So say I'm trying to make a mailbox seem unfamiliar or different, or invite my readers to look at a mailbox in a way they've never looked at a mailbox before. If I have 8 pages to do that, it feels to me like the maybe quickest, most efficient way to do that is to let that mailbox start acting in ways that a mailbox is not supposed to act. To let that mailbox start violating rules of the universe, right? Maybe you go to check the mail one day and there's, instead of a letter, there's a message in a bottle. Right? And it's on old parchment. If the mailbox starts acting in ways that it's not supposed to, and maybe that message in a bottle, when you take it out, what's written on it is a threat. I'm coming for you. The next day, another message in a bottle. There's nothing you can do about it. Right? If you make it unfamiliar, I feel like horror is the quickest way to defamiliarize something.
Follow-up question to that is sort of it's interesting when you talked about how many stories that you start with when you're putting together a collection, but I'm sort of fascinated in how those collections are assembled once the stories are chosen. And is there sort of an art or science to the order in which the stories are presented, the cadence at which you're reading, like go from something kind of spooky to something scary to something a little more offbeat? Are you and your publisher trying to do something with the specific order, trying to accomplish a particular effect in the reader?
Yeah, we talk a lot about, after we've selected the 13 stories that are going to go in the collection, we talk a lot about the ordering of the stories, things that we consider. We consider things like how long each story is. We don't want to put too many long stories together. We don't want to put too many short stories together. Thematically, we talk about whether the story ends in kind of a release or whether it ends in despair. So, and we try to balance, we try not to have too many of those next to each other. That was easier in my first book to do, because in the first book, there's a nice balance between stories that end in despair and stories that end in relief. And with the second book, most of them end in despair, right? I mean, if you're a kid in one of my stories, buckle up. It's probably going to be bad for you. And so we talk a little bit about that. We talk about the gender of the main character, right? We don't want to have like 4 or 5 boy stories next together or 4 or 5 girl stories next together. We talk about point of view. Some of the stories are written in first person. Some of the stories are written in third person. We want to have a nice kind of interchange, right? Give the reader some relief from first person and third person. And so you throw in all of these factors, and it actually becomes a pretty complex thing when you start shifting things. There's a couple of and there's a couple stories in the second book. They couldn't be next to each other because like there's one about a snowman that refuses to melt. So this kind of endless winter is going on. And then there's another one, my hand right there, is about a boy who gets caught in a situation where he gets colder and colder and colder. And we didn't want 2 kind of cold stories right next to each other. So we needed to try and put some distance between those. And so there's all these different factors that go into figuring out how to, the correct way or the best way to assemble these stories. And I actually made a table with all of these, like point of view, gender of main character, ending in relief or despair, themes explored, and then I put them on 3x5 cards. And then I spent all this time on the floor of my office, like shuffling them around, figuring out how we could get the right balance and how to put it together.
That is tough and interesting. And I love that, like, release or despair. That's, you know, that's where I've gone wrong in the past when I've tried to write middle grade short stories. I love despair. I love deep, deep, deep despair. That's where all of my stories end.
Well, I think with short fiction, another reason I write short fiction is because if a reader invests 250 pages in a character, like a middle grade reader, and then it ends just terribly,
you have to end with hope. Yeah.
They're going to be mad. Right? They're going to hate you. But if you write like an 8-page story about a character who maybe has a major flaw and is kind of a jerk, and that character gets it in the end, well, then the reader's okay, right? I think in short forms, you can end sadly, or you can end in a bad place, and readers will be more forgiving or tolerant of that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I have my darkest thing ever was in this collection. It's like very horrific and gory and total despair in the end. That was so fun. But you were talking earlier, something that really resonated with me when you said, like, with the short stories, you have to write a lot of ones that didn't work until you get to those ones that do work. And I think that's so true. And that's something that we forget as authors, especially if you're working in longer form stuff, or especially if you're trying to do like, to make a full-time living at doing something creative. Like, you forget that the fact that you have to do those things that don't work in order to get to the ones that do work, you forget that that's still a necessary part of the process, even though it's really tough that it is, and it's really inconvenient that that's still a part of the process. So I think that was just a really good reminder for creative people out there, or if you're working on something and you haven't like had a story published, or you're just working on your first story, I think that's really important to keep in mind, because that's just all part of the process. And
yeah, I think especially because you don't see other people's processes, you only see the fantastic book that appears on the shelves. And yeah, it's really inconvenient that you have to sometimes fail or work through a draft and that it doesn't just come out perfect.
Josh, I
Yeah.
love that you refer to it as really inconvenient, as opposed to soul crushing, right?
Devastating.
Devastating.
I know. Yes.
Yeah, I recently posted a whole thread on Twitter of like, here's all my failures. Like my first debut came out,
Mm,
and I was just like, well, here's
mm,
all the books I wrote beforehand, and here's why they didn't happen. And I think that kind of conversation is important, for writers, because a lot of times it does seem like I'm just brilliant and I sold my book in 5 whole minutes and I got $1 million. And that's not really like the reality of it. I think
Right. I mean,
exposing the process.
I published my first book when I was 45.
Yeah.
And that was not the original plan, right? I mean, I didn't publish my first book at 45 because that's how I wanted it to go, right? I mean, that's not the way that worked. And so I think you're right. I think, Josh, what you point out is that we don't see other people's processes. All we see is the book on the shelf and think that we're not like them. But I think that we need to recognize that everybody has this process that is fraught with lurches and jerks in the road. That there's no such thing as a wrong timetable, right? I debuted at 45, and that was not the original plan, but my process required me to debut at 45, and there's no shame in that. And every writer needs to embrace whatever their individual process and their individual timeline is.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Having debuted at 44, I absolutely agree. Um, so in terms of since we're talking about process, since we're on the topic of process, I know you talked a little bit about like um the sandbox. It made me think of that Shannon, I think it was Shannon Hale quote about like first draft is you're filling the sandbox and second draft is like you can build castles. So like you talked about how in for you, you're like, just keep going, keep going. So like, what is your revision process like? Like, how do you go about that when you're looking at stories, which is just a very different beast than novels? And I guess also like, how much does your editor, how involved is your editor in your revision process when you're talking about like individual stories?
Most of my revision happens before my agent or editor even take a look at it. Now, that's not to say I don't do a ton of revision after they take a look at it, because I do, but I'm like a chronic reviser. So I'll write a draft of a story, I'll print it out, I'll stick it in a drawer, and I let it sit there for, the rule for me is 2 weeks before I can look at it again. I need 2 weeks of distance before I can go back to that story. And so after 2 weeks, I'll pull it out of the drawer and look at it. And with a fresh set of eyes 2 weeks later, I'm often able to see things I didn't know when I was in the midst of the drafting process, things that I didn't recognize. The character isn't working, the ending is flat, the structure of the story isn't elegant. And so I'll see those sorts of things that I wasn't able to. Again, I have this great peer group that I can share my work with, and they're great at giving me feedback and convincing me when I'm wrong. And so that's enormously helpful. I also have one of the most useful things, I should mention this, is a dear friend of mine is a 4th grade teacher here in my community, and I have a standing invitation to visit her class whenever I want. And so sometimes I'll just send her a text and say, I got a story I want to test out. Can I come to class and read it to your students and see what happens? And so I'll just wander in and test out a story on children. And I don't necessarily ask for feedback from the kids, but just watching their faces as I read them a story usually tells me everything I need to know.
So if you're getting like horrified looks, you're like, okay, success.
Yeah. If I'm getting too horrified looks, though, if I get calls from parents,
right,
I know I went too far.
What goes into, so when you're putting together a short story collection, are you thinking about a particular theme that all of the stories kind of can be grouped together in? Or, so as you look towards, whatever you'll be working on next, do you start with a general theme that you build around? Or do you just start with a bunch of disparate ideas and see kind of where it goes?
I don't start with theme. In fact, I almost never think about theme. I think that I'm afraid that if I spent time thinking about theme and if I wrote to a theme, I would end up writing propaganda and not literature. Right? That I'd be so interested in, I'm going to write a short story that talks about the importance of getting vaccinated, right? And I'm a big fan of getting vaccinated. Let me make that clear. And I wish everybody was vaccinated. Let me be really clear about that. But if I set out to write a story with any theme, even a less political theme, I feel like I'd be dangerously close to propaganda, and I don't want to go in that direction. So, and I sort of believe that just because we're human beings who are passionate about things and interested in things, themes will naturally emerge. We won't have to coax them. They will come naturally if the stories we're telling is true.
Yes, I love that. And a reminder again, we are taking your questions, so get those in the chat right away. But Josh, so I know we had mentioned, I don't know if this is like secret information or not, but you had mentioned that you might be trying something involving art and these books, because there's such cool art in these books. So we haven't talked about Sarah Coleman, like the illustrator. I don't know if you have any illustrations to show us, but they're so cool. And yeah, I know you have one on your hand too that I saw a little, a little sneak peek.
So I visited a middle school today. And as part of the pre-order campaign for this book, we put together these fake tattoos of a skull.
Awesome.
And so whenever I visit middle schools, I put a fake tattoo on my hand, and in the middle of my presentation, I show it to kids and try and get them freaked out. So it's the same skull that's on the cover of the book on that finger right there.
Awesome.
But Sarah Coleman is just one of my favorite people on the whole entire planet. She's the illustrator who has created illustrations that accompanies each of the stories in both of my books. And she's incredibly talented. And we don't really collaborate when she's creating an illustration. And I would never presume to tell her how to do her job, because she's a professional and she's an expert, and I'm gonna just let her do her thing, right? My thinking is I'm just gonna get out of her way and let her do her job, because she's really, really good at what she does. But so here's some of my favorite illustrations from the book. Let's see if I can get that lined up right. This is from a story about a really creepy clown.
That was in your pre-order campaign, which I proudly now own. Thank you.
I wrote a story about a really creepy ice cream cone. And let's see. Here's the ice cream man.
Her drawings are amazing.
They are chilling.
They're
this
amazing.
Ice cream man, I don't know if you can get all the detail there, but look at those eyes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is one chilling ice cream man. And then maybe, I don't know if this is my favorite or not. There's so many that are great. I wrote a story about like a really creepy doll.
Oh, I love that one.
Right? Wasn't this one
face.
just?
Yep.
Yeah, just spectacular. So
Sarah, is that like sitting right beside you, Kim? That same doll?
And it is. Yeah, it was inspired by my best friend Mabel.
That's Mabel.
So, yeah.
Well. So yeah, Sarah does just absolutely remarkable work, and she's designed both of the book covers of my books, which I might add glow in the dark. Both of the covers for my books glow in the dark, which is just
so
an
cool.
enormous amount of fun.
As they would have to, because it's too scary otherwise, right?
Just a little light in a world of darkness. Yeah. That's all you need, is just a little bit of light in this world of darkness.
Yeah, that's so cool. And I love, especially with scary stories, there's such a great tradition, because we all remember the scary stories to tell in the dark. Like on Allie's shirt had those amazing illustrations that were so creepy. And it's like a big part of the story, I feel like. So it's really cool that you got the opportunity to have that illustrated.
All right, so I just have to say, since we're discussing scary stories to tell in the dark, I believe it is a favorite of everyone here. Yes. How do you feel, Josh, about those comparisons? Because you know, like I've seen people talking about your books and saying that you are like the heir apparent to Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. And like, that must be amazing, but also like, whoa, like,
It's
how do you feel?
it's really amazing. There are two of my heroes, two of my storytelling heroes from my childhood and from my life are obviously Alvin Schwartz from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and Rod Serling, who did The Twilight Zone.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been incredibly like gratifying, but also really humbling to be compared to both of my heroes. Right. And so to be compared, the first time I read a review and it compared me to Rod Serling, I kind of teared up because I was so honored to be in the same sentence as this guy, you know. And School Library Journal, after I wrote my second book, wrote a review that Ali referred to that said that I was the heir apparent of Alvin Schwartz, and I don't know how any children's horror writer doesn't tear up at a line like that, right? I mean, I was so moved. But at the same time, there's another part of me which is like, oh my gosh, no pressure, right? I mean, holy cow, because I revere these people. I revere these storytellers, and I love what they have done and the contributions that they have made. And I don't see myself in that same ballpark, not like nowhere near it. And so it's nice to have those comparisons drawn, but I still feel like there's a lot of work to do. Right? I still feel like there's like in order to be worthy of those comparisons, I feel like there's a lot of work to do.
I definitely, I get that, but you know what? Like, it's worthy. It really is. Like, enjoy it, embrace it. These are good stories, man. They're really good stories.
You're very kind, Ellie.
They are. I love the Twilight Zone comparison too, because I'm such a huge fan of those. And there's definitely a similarity, because the Twilight Zone is all about what you were saying, like looking at things that should be ordinary, but they're definitely not, because now we're in the Twilight Zone. Like, so do you think that you're ever going to like run out of ordinary objects that you can ruin forever for the children of the world?
I don't think so. I think that especially in like the modern world that we live in, there are like we are a commercial society. Right. And there's always a new thing that we're all buying and then ignoring. Right. I mean, we have filled this planet just chock full of stuff. And I think that so much of it just becomes background noise in our lives. And what I'm trying to do is take a note of that background noise and bring it back to the forefront, ask us to see it in a new way. And I don't see myself running out. I think the bigger problem is that there are more story ideas than I have life left to write. I think that's the bigger problem.
Yeah, if you only get 13 in every book, yeah, that's not that many. It's true. And I feel like there are more ordinary objects out there that need to get revenge upon us for what we have done to them, right? And that's a big thing. You have a lot of like revenge stories, I feel like the pillow gets its revenge, and like the oatmeal gets its revenge.
The trees got their revenge.
Yeah, the trees definitely got their revenge.
Come on.
I'm all about dark justice.
I love that. Oh, goodness. Well, let me turn it over to Josh R. So if you have a question.
Well, what maybe you touched on this earlier, but what is the one story that you think maybe has gone too far, that you pulled back and you're like, that one I can't submit, or okay, that one is maybe too much?
The skin one was not too far, so that doesn't count. The skin one was perfectly fine. Put it in a book tomorrow. Don't worry about it.
Gee whiz. Are there other stories I've written that have gone too far? I have a big list of them up here, so I'm going to turn for just a second. I've always been really creeped out by the frozen food aisle in the grocery store. It's just
don't ruin shopping, man. Don't ruin shopping. We all gotta shop.
The frozen food aisle at the grocery store is a terrifying place, and I'm going to tell you why.
And like, yeah,
it's a terrifying place because it's colder than the rest of the store. You turn into the frozen food aisle and you get hit with this like wave of cold air, and there's the constant like sucking sounds of the doors opening and closing, and the refrigeration is like louder there because of the freezers, right? So there's this like hum that constantly goes on there, and these tall glass doors that have these handprints always on them, and we think the handprints are on the outside of the doors, but what if they're coming from the inside of the doors, right? And the frozen food aisle is, if you think about it, it's mostly stacked up dead things, right? We take dead things, chickens, cows, and we stack them up all neatly and try to make them look tidy when there's nothing tidy about all of these dead things in the frozen food aisle, right? It's like this terrifying place. And so another story I wrote that I think maybe went too far, Josh, was set in the frozen food aisle of a grocery store, and I tried to turn the frozen food aisle into this place of like horror, and I kind of went too far with stacked up dead things, and that's all.
I think you've already scarred Allie just from describing it.
I mean, listen, ladies and gentlemen, Josh Allen has ruined shopping. Congratulations. Like, frozen food is not a thing you get to have anymore. That's it. It's over.
And I'm like delighted. I like, maybe I'll stop using Instacart and I'll go back to like the grocery store now because it sounds amazing.
But just hearing you describe it, it's amazing. I mean, you really just painted a picture. And you gave us setting, you gave us atmosphere, and you kind of imagine, just from what you said, just imagine the sort of creepiness that I've never really considered of the frozen food aisle. It's that's a skill. I mean, it's a skill and a talent that you've developed to be able to just look at these items and kind of create this scenario around them to turn them into something menacing.
Well, thank you.
And so I'm wondering, I do this thing a lot where I read other people's stuff, like your stuff, for example, or like right now I'm finally reading Nosferatu by Joe Hill. And so you read the stuff and you're like, there's parts of it where you're like, oh gosh, I'm just so mad. I'm so angry that I didn't think of that and I didn't write that and it wasn't my idea and I can't like do that exactly like that now because it's like I really want to do it. Do you ever like read something or watch something and the idea is like so good you're almost like overcome with like professional jealousy? Or do you find ways to like use that to inspire your own writing though?
Yeah. There's this scene, I think I've talked about it with some of you before, but there's this scene in Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury, where there's this witch who's looking for these two boys, and this witch has her eyes sewn shut, which I just think is such a wonderfully creepy image. And the implication is by having her eyes sewn shut, she has developed or been granted some kind of sixth sense to compensate for her blindness. And she's looking for these two boys. And it sounds just absurd, right? It sounds completely absurd what happens. She gets in a hot air balloon, and this witch is floating in a hot air balloon over this town looking for these two boys. And she kind of has this green mist that she's sending twining into the streets. And it's so chilling. It sounds absurd. Witch in a hot air balloon with her eyes sewn shut. Sounds like green mist twining through the streets. It sounds like the most absurd thing ever. But I remember reading that for the first time as a kid, and I honestly believe that reading that scene is when I fell in love with craft. Because Bradbury was able to take this like kind of absurd thing and really give us chills from it, like really freak us out. And I sort of recognized reading that this is skill, right? The ability to do this is skill. He's doing this because he's studied this craft and he knows how to make this happen. And I wish I wrote that. Like, I wish so badly that I wrote Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury. If there's any book on the planet I wish had my name on it and not somebody else's, I think that's it.
It's so interesting. I've often thought about how often the things that we write, we're trying to recreate something that we experienced, um, you know, something we experienced in our lives, reading another book, listening to a piece of music that moved us in a certain way. And you're not trying to, copy the experience, but you're trying to produce that same emotion, that same feeling in someone else. And yeah, there's a lot of examples of where I'm reading a book and I have that sort of exquisite, like admiration / jealousy, that it sort of goes hand in hand. Like, I'm so mad that you wrote this amazing thing that I love.
Yeah, right. That happens to me a lot when I'm reading Neil Shusterman as well. I read Neil Shusterman, and I feel like he's a really elegant writer who understands craft. And sometimes I read his stuff, and I'm like, oh man, this guy's too good, and I hate him.
Right? My son and I were just talking about him today. He's a big fan of him too.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing for me. Like, I feel like when I'm writing, there are certain times when I can only read like certain types of books. Do you ever have that sort of feeling? Like, sometimes it's just that, like you said, if it's going to be one of those authors that I know, I'm going to have that overwhelming feeling of like, I could never, this is so beautiful and I could never recreate this. Maybe there's a point in my writing process where I can't handle reading that right then. I'm going to have to wait a little bit. Or, I don't know. I just feel like there's certain times throughout my process that I can only read certain things. Do you ever feel like that?
Well, as an English professor, I'm afraid that that part inside me that says I don't feel like reading this right now has been killed, right? Because I have to read like student essays. Like, I can't tell you how many essays I've read on gun control, right? I don't even care what side the students take anymore. If I have to read another gun control essay, I don't know what I'll do, right? So that part of me that can say I'm going to stop reading this, it doesn't exist, right? It's been killed by my profession.
So, haunted gun control essay coming in in 2 years or so?
Yes. Wow. Well, and when you're talking about like taking the most absurd ideas and like turning them into something that actually scares us, and that's what represents like the skill of the horror author. I mean, that just defines like Stephen King to me, right? Like, that's like every single thing. Like the Pet Cemetery, the clown, really no, but like it works because of that skill in crafting the characters that are so believable that everything else you buy into. It's interesting. I mean, I think it's with every type of story, but especially with horror, because we're often diving into these things that are a little bit unbelievable or out of the ordinary or supernatural or something.
Well, and for me, so much of what I'm drawn to in my writing is the challenge of doing just that, right? I admire craft, and so I feel like, okay, if I can turn Pop-Tarts terrifying, right? Then that's the kind of craft that I want to accomplish. I want the kind of craft where I can take an ordinary everyday thing, even a pleasant thing like a Pop-Tart, and the next time a kid walks into the kitchen and sees a Pop-Tart, they shiver, right? If you can pull that off, I feel like you've done something.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I love that that's your life mission. I support it. I'm all here for it. But we are just about out of time. So just a reminder, if anybody has a very last minute question they wanted to get in, who's out there watching, get that in now. And if any of you all have any last minute questions, now is the time.
I have a last minute question because Josh wrote an amazing piece about why horror is good for kids, and I just want him to talk about it a little bit because I loved it.
Okay, so I read this book years ago by Jonathan Gottschall called "The Storytelling Animal: How Stories Make Us Human." I think I'm getting the subtitle right. "The Storytelling Animal" is the title. And in that book, Jonathan Gottschall's thesis is that fiction is like a flight simulator. that before we let pilots fly in real planes, we make them practice in a flight simulator, because that's a safe place where they can go to experience all the different scenarios that they might encounter when they're flying a real plane. And he says, this is one of the greatest benefits of fiction. Fiction is a flight simulator. It allows us to go into a space where we can practice complex emotions, complex situations, and we can do so safely. And that way, you know, so one day we're all going to have to grow up and move out of the house, right? When we're kids, we're going to have to grow up and move out of the house. And Jonathan Gottschall would probably say, you know what, if we've read a lot of fiction about people who grow up and move out of the house, some do it successfully, some do it less successfully, we'll probably be better equipped to grow up and move out of the house ourselves. And so horror, I believe, is good for kids, because if fiction is a flight simulator, what are we practicing when we read horror? What skills are we practicing? Well, what we're practicing is bravery, right? We're practicing being brave. We're going into these stories and we're feeling a little bit of tension, a little bit of fear, a little bit of anxiety, and our brains are becoming acclimated to navigating tension, fear, and anxiety, so that in our real lives, when we encounter tension, fear, and anxiety, we don't freak out. Our brains have already done this in fiction over and over and over again, and so we're better equipped. I found a study, after I wrote that piece, Allie, I found a study about 2 weeks ago that I'm going to use in future presentations, that looked at whether people who read horror fiction, who consume horror fiction in film and literature, whether they were emotionally resilient during the pandemic than people who didn't. And they were. People who consume horror, especially alien invasion and zombie horror, fared emotionally better through the pandemic than people who did not consume those things. And with Jonathan Gottschall's thesis, it makes sense, right? These people have practiced the pandemic in literature like 1,000 times. And so then when the pandemic actually hit, they were more emotionally equipped to deal with it.
I love that. We're prepared.
That study, by the way, was from researchers at the University of Chicago and Penn State University.
Nice.
That's so funny. I'm like, well, I've seen The Walking Dead and The X-Files like a million times. So I guess that's why I'm doing
You're basically indestructible at this point.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, goodness. Well, we did have a question come up from Tim Allen. Do you have any comments about the shortness of your short stories and modern day attention spans?
Do I have any comments about the shortness of my short stories and modern day attention spans of my target audience? I don't. I want to help kids become readers. That's what I'm really most interested in. And I'm really drawn to helping what we sometimes call reluctant readers. And I don't know that I want to say anything about the attention spans of my target audience, but I do want to say this. I think that reading long books is hard no matter who you are. And I think that when you're in 3rd grade and you're reading The Magic Tree House and you're loving it, I think that's great. But I think 3 years later, literally 3 years later, people hand you the Scarlet Letter and say, read this, you're going to love it. And you're not going to love it, right? Because it wasn't written for you. And I don't know why teachers continue handing 13-year-olds the Scarlet Letter or any number of books that were not written for them. And I think that we need to help convince young people that they should continue being readers. And I think that short fiction is less intimidating for a lot of people who've maybe had some bad reading experiences in school and who have been maybe wounded by some failings of public education and the formal education system. And so I write short fiction because I'm trying to win back a young audience that we've started to lose. I'm trying to get them back on board.
Come on back. And Like I mentioned, I love short stories. There's times when I just can't, short stories are just the thing that I want to read. And they're always my go-to because you just can't wrap your brain around the whole thing. So I think they're so important and they're their own art form. And we really appreciated hanging out with you tonight. Josh Allen, why don't you tell people where they can find you online and find Only If You Dare?
I am on Instagram and Twitter at JustJoshAllen. And Only If You Dare and Out to Get You are available wherever books are sold. And I want to thank Kim, Josh, Allie. You three are fantastic. Thank you so much for being here with me tonight.
You're welcome. It was great.
Three of my favorite people.
Well, and I also want to give a plug to Josh Roberts because tomorrow night, my brain's working, it's tomorrow, right? Tomorrow night is our book club live discussion of The Witches of Willow Cove by Josh Roberts at the same time right here. So I hope everyone will join us. Josh, do you want to give us a teaser about your book?
Oh my gosh, I wasn't prepared for this. I'm not prepared to talk about myself.
Witches.
There's witches. It's set in New England. It's kind of spooky. It's mystery. And I think it's not too bad. So you should try it.
Yeah, and even if you haven't read it, come and learn more about it. Tomorrow you can ask Josh all your questions about the book or the writing process. So that's tomorrow night for Book Club Live. And I'm going to play us out on our little reminder. And thanks again to everyone for joining us tonight.